Somewhere in a box of unsorted papers, bought at a house clearance in the west of England, there is a small leather notebook that nobody has ever published. The man who sold it did not know what it was. He listed it as a Victorian lady's diary, water-stained, a few pages torn out, of little value. It sat in a plastic sleeve for the better part of a decade, and on the 17th surviving page, in a careful sloping hand, a woman writes that when she sang one particular note into the glass showed her something she was never meant to see. She dates the entry to the spring of 1885. She does not name the building. She writes only that she stopped singing in public not long after, and that she hoped whoever found this would understand why. I want to be honest with you before we go any further. I cannot prove that this notebook is genuine, and I cannot prove that the woman who wrote it saw anything at all. What I can tell you is that the year she names, 1885, was one of the strangest years in the entire history of sound. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. It was the year the world quietly agreed, for the first time, on what a musical note should be. It was the year a Welsh singer was pressing flowers and ferns and whole cathedrals out of her own voice in a laboratory in London and could not explain how. It was the year a man in Philadelphia claimed he could run an engine on nothing but vibration, and half the financiers on the eastern seaboard believed him enough to hand over their fortunes. And it was the year, if you follow the thread far enough, that a certain kind of knowledge about sound went very quiet and never came back. So let me tell you what she wrote, and then let me show you why it might not be madness. The woman calls herself only by a first name in the early pages, Adelaide, and later signs one entry, Adelaide Merrow. If that was her real name, she left almost no trace in the concert records of the period, which is itself worth noticing, because she writes like someone who performed for a living. She describes green rooms and gas footlights and the particular exhaustion of singing 6 nights a week. She describes a teacher, an old Italian she calls only Signor V, who told her that the note she was being asked to sing every night was wrong, not wrong for her voice, wrong in itself. He told her that when he was a boy the orchestras had tuned lower, that the pitch had been creeping upward his whole life, and that something had been taken out of the music without anyone asking the people who actually had to sing it. That detail alone stopped me, because it is true. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, the pitch that European orchestras tuned to had been drifting steadily higher. There was no single standard. A note called A in Vienna was not the same as an A in Paris or an A in a village church in Wales. Instrument makers pushed the pitch up because higher tuning sounded brighter in a crowded concert hall, and singers hated it because it strained their voices toward breaking. Composers complained in letters we still have. And older people insisted, exactly as Adelaide's teacher had, that the music of their childhood sat lower and moved through the body differently. In 1885 that long argument was settled. A conference in Vienna set an international standard pitch, and the world of formal music began, slowly, to agree on a single fixed value for that note. France had already fixed its own legal pitch by government decree years before, the so-called diapason normal, a number chosen by a state commission and written into law. And in that same narrow span of time, in London, a scholar named Alexander Ellis stood before the Society of Arts and read a long, careful study on the musical scales of many nations, showing that the scales the rest of the world used did not match the European one at all. There was nothing natural, he showed, nothing inevitable, about the tuning that was about to be locked into place for everyone alive. Hold that thought, because Adelaide held it too. She writes that Signor V gave her a tuning fork, an old and heavy one, and told her it carried the note the way it used to be. He told her to sing to that in private, and to never mind what the conductor in front of her wanted. And she writes that when she sang to the old fork, alone, into the apparatus she had built on her own kitchen table, the patterns were different, cleaner, more alive, is the word she keeps using, as if the sound suddenly remembered what it was for. Now I have to explain the apparatus. because this is where a reasonable person wants to close the notebook and walk away, and this is exactly where the notebook stops being impossible. There was a real woman doing precisely what Adelaide describes, at precisely this time, and her name was Margaret Watts Hughes. She was a celebrated Welsh soprano, admired across Britain, and she was also, quietly, an inventor. In the 1880s she built a device she called the idophone. It was simple enough that anyone could copy it. A wide mouthpiece, a short tube, and a stretched elastic membrane laid flat across the top like the skin of a small drum. She would scatter fine powder, or sometimes a thin damp paste, across the membrane, and then she would sing a long sustained note down into the tube. The vibration of her own voice threw the material into shapes. She expected shapes. Anyone who knew a little physics expected shapes. What she did not expect was what the shapes looked like. When she sang certain notes, the powder arranged itself into geometric stars and lattices, the kind of thing you might accept from simple vibration. But when she sang others, and held them steady, and let her voice waver in one particular way, the material climbed up out of the flat and built itself into forms that looked like ferns, like trees, complete with trunk and spreading branches, like flowers with layered petals and stems, like the coiled spirals of a seashell. She was drawing, living, growing things out of nothing but the sound of a human voice, and she was too good a scientist to pretend she understood it. She photographed them. She published them, carefully and honestly, and she admitted plainly in print that she could not explain why her voice built gardens. She called them voice figures. She showed them to men of science, to the sort of learned circles that ran the institutions of Victorian Britain, and the men of science looked and admired and moved on, because there was no theory to file it under. And a thing with no theory to file it under has a quiet way of being set on a high shelf and left there. Her book still exists. You can find the plates. A working soprano, in the middle of the most industrial society the world had yet produced, grew trees out of her singing voice and photographed them. And it is a footnote, and almost no one has heard of her. What ought to disturb you about her plates is not that they are beautiful. It is that the tree her voice built looks unmistakably like the tree of life, carved and painted in temples and holy books from one end of the ancient world to the other, and that the flowers her voice built look like the rosettes cut into stonework by people who had never heard a single note of European opera and never would. Either the human voice naturally builds the same symbols that ancient sacred art is saturated with, which is astonishing on its own, or the ancient art was copied from something its makers had also seen in some room, in some scattering of powder, at the moment somebody sang. Watts Hughes noticed the resemblance herself. She remarked on it in print. And then, like every learned man who looked at her flowers, she gently set the thought back down and did not pick it up again. So when Adelaide Merrow writes that she built a membrane and a mouthpiece on her kitchen table and sang into powder and watched it grow into shapes, she is not describing a fantasy. She is describing the single most documented acoustic curiosity of her exact decade. The technology in her notebook is real. The results she claims are results that a real, respected, named singer obtained in public, in print, in the same years, in the same country. The only difference is what Adelaide chose to do next. Watts Hughes stayed in the laboratory. She kept singing into her membrane and photographing the flowers her voice made, and she kept it gentle and scientific and safe. Adelaide got curious about the shapes themselves. She writes that she began to realize she had seen them somewhere before. The six-fold stars, the branching stems, the tight interlacing lattices. She had seen them carved into the stone bosses on the ceiling of an old chapel where she was sometimes hired to sing for funerals. She had seen them worked into the tracery of its windows. She had seen them beaten into the iron of its gate. And she could not shake the thought that the people who built that chapel had somehow already known the shapes her voice was making and had cut them into stone on purpose, centuries before anyone had a membrane and a box of powder to coax them into the light. This is the point in the notebook where the handwriting changes. It gets smaller, more hurried. The lines run downhill, and she starts writing about the glass. There is a phenomenon here that anyone can verify, that has been known and understood since long before Adelaide was born. A German physicist named Ernst Chladni, working in the 1700s, discovered that if you scatter fine sand on a metal plate and draw a violin bow along its edge, the sand leaps away from the parts of the plate that are shaking hardest and settles along the still lines, the nodes, tracing out intricate symmetrical patterns that change completely with every change of pitch. They are called Chladni figures. They are real. They are taught in physics classrooms today, and any teacher with a plate and a bow can show them to you in a minute. A few decades later, Michael Faraday showed that the surface of a vibrating liquid does the very same thing, breaking into standing patterns of ridges and cells. In the 20th century, a Swiss doctor named Hans Jenny spent years photographing these patterns in powders and pastes and liquids and gave the whole study a name. He called it cymatics. Sound has a shape. Sustain a tone against a surface, and that surface will show you the geometry hidden inside the tone. None of this is mystical. All of it is on the exam. Adelaide knew Chladni. She names him. And she writes that one evening, alone in that chapel after a burial, tuning herself to the old heavy fork Signor V had given her, she stood at the front and sang a low, sustained note straight up at the great east window. The tall one behind the altar with its old, cheap, uneven glass, the kind that ripples and warps because it was never made truly flat. And she writes that the glass answered, that the flaw in the glass, the ripple that distorted everything behind it, at that one exact pitch, resolved. That looking through it while she held the note she saw, not the churchyard and the yew trees she knew were on the other side, but a city, streets laid out in long straight lines, towers, a vast skyline that belonged to no town she had ever visited, standing over the graves like a reflection with nothing in the room to cast it. She held the note, she writes, until her breath gave out entirely, and the city held for as long as the note held, and vanished in the same instant she fell silent. Now, you are a sensible person, and I am trying very hard to be one too, and there is a boring explanation sitting right there in the open, and we should say it out loud before we do anything else. Old handmade glass is full of distortions and bubbles and flow lines. A singer, exhausted after a day of funerals, standing alone at night in a cold stone building, holding a single low note until she is starved of breath, is a person primed to see things that are not there. Oxygen starvation produces visual disturbance. Fatigue produces it. Suggestion does the rest, and her head had been full of nothing but emerging shapes for weeks. Most likely a tired woman saw a smear in bad glass, and her mind, full of the geometry her voice had built for weeks, filled it in and called it a city. That explanation asks for nothing new to exist, and it may simply be the correct one. I want you to hold on to it. But I promised you the thread, so let me pull it, because the reason this notebook genuinely unsettles me is not the vision itself. It is everything the vision is sitting inside. Consider the man in Philadelphia. His name was John Keely, and across the 1870s and 1880s he told the world he had discovered a new force of nature. He called it sympathetic vibratory physics. He claimed that by tuning vibrations with enough precision, by finding the exact resonant note of matter itself, he could release enormous power out of ordinary water and ordinary air, enough to turn engines, enough to light and move a whole city, at almost no cost at all. He built strange machines bristling with tuning forks and resonating spheres and steel wires. He gave demonstrations in his workshop. Metal moved, heavy weights lifted, and serious men, men with real money and hard reputations, formed the Keely Motor Company around him and poured a genuine fortune into his hands, convinced this quiet mechanic had found a way to draw power out of resonance the way you draw water from a well. The official history is that Keely was a fraud, that after he died, investigators tore up his workshop floor and found hidden pipes and a concealed reservoir of compressed air feeding his miracle from below, and that the whole business had been a long and expensive confidence trick. That may be exactly and completely true. But sit with the shape of the story for one moment. In the same decade, a singer was growing ferns out of her voice, and the whole world was busy fixing one legal pitch for everyone. A man had persuaded the smartest money in America that the correct vibration could unlock power out of nothing. Whether he was a genius or a swindler, an entire generation of hard-headed capitalists plainly believed that sound and resonance were a doorway to some kind of energy that the coal men and the oil men and the electric men had not yet managed to corner. And then he died, and it was all declared nonsense, and the belief died right there with him, precisely on schedule. Ask yourself who benefits when a technology that runs on vibration is proven a hoax. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then come back. Ask who benefits when the answer to power is decided, once and finally, to be coal and oil and the electric grid and the little meter on the wall that counts up what you owe every month. A machine you build one time and tune, that draws its energy from resonance and then asks nothing further of you, is not a business. It cannot be sold to you again by the unit. It cannot be metered. It threatens every single fortune that was being assembled at that exact moment around a fuel you have to go out and buy all over again tomorrow. I'm not telling you Keeley was real. I am telling you that if he ever had been, the shape of the century that followed is the precise shape you would expect if such a thing had been quietly and permanently buried. There is more, and it is not fringe. Everyone accepts that a soprano holding the right note can shatter a wine glass, because the note matches the natural resonance of the glass and pours energy into it faster than the glass can shed it until it fails. Everyone accepts that soldiers break step when they cross a bridge, because a column marching in rhythm can drive a bridge at its resonant frequency and bring the whole span down, and history has the collapsed bridges to prove it. Resonance is not a theory. It is a physical force with the documented power to destroy stone and steel. The only genuinely strange idea in Adelaide's notebook is not that sound has power. We know sound has power. The strange idea is that someone, long ago, learned to aim it. Nikola Tesla understood this better than almost anyone of his age. Late in his life, he claimed he had once clamped a small oscillator to an iron pillar in his New York workshop, set it to the resonant frequency of the building itself, and felt the whole structure begin to shudder around him, harder and harder, until he had to smash the device with a hammer to keep it from bringing the walls down. He called it his earthquake machine. Historians argue about how much of that story is showmanship, but Tesla's conviction was not exaggeration at all. He believed that if you knew the true resonant note of a thing, anything, a bridge, a building, the planet under your feet, you held a lever on it out of all proportion to the strength in your arm. Find the right note, and a whisper can move a mountain. That is not mysticism. That is only resonance, followed honestly all the way to the end of its own logic. And Adelaide, it turns out, was not the only one. Folded into the back of the notebook, behind the torn pages, in a different and older hand, there is a single loose sheet. It is a fragment of a letter, unsigned, but the phrasing and the constant talk of the old pitch make it almost certainly Signor V. Whoever wrote it says that he had known 2 other singers across his long life who reported the very same thing. Not a city, in their cases, but each of them, singing the old note alone in an old stone room, had described the distinct feeling that the room was listening back, that the walls seemed to lean inward. One of them, he writes, a tenor in Naples, refused ever again to sing in one particular church and would never once say why. The writer ends by warning his pupil directly that the gift of hearing the old note is also its burden, and that she would be wise to sing only what she was paid to sing and leave the rest well alone. She did not take the advice, but somebody kept his letter. And here is where the singer and the inventor and the pitch conference stop being 3 separate stories. The revisionist argument, the one people online now call Tartaria, the one this channel keeps circling back to, is not truly about a lost empire with an odd foreign name. Strip away all the noise and the memes, and what is left underneath is one stubborn, serious question. Why does so much of the architecture of the deep past look as though it was built for a purpose we no longer understand or use? Think of the immense exhibition halls thrown up for the great world's fairs of the 19th century, buildings of glass and iron and carved stone, acoustically perfect, larger than anything we bother to build now, and then torn down again within a year or 2, as though they were disposable scenery. Photographs survive of those fairgrounds. Whole cities of domes and colonnades and vaulted halls, built supposedly in a few months and then flattened and carted away before the paint had dried. The official account is plaster and lath and cheap temporary work, and much of it surely was. But stand a while in front of those photographs and the question does not go away. Who builds a flawless acoustic palace the size of a small town in order to knock it down again the following spring? Think of the cathedrals that took a village 300 years to raise and that were tuned, whether the guidebooks admit it or not, to ring. Every master mason knew that a stone building has a voice. The old builders shaped their vaults and domes and long stone naves so that a single sung note would enter and hold and layer over itself and come back to the singer changed and enlarged. Stand today in certain old chapels and simply hum, and the room will hum back at you and find the exact note you did not even know you were reaching toward. And this is not only a matter of old English chapels. Deep beneath the island of Malta there is a carved underground temple called the Hypogeum, cut into solid rock more than 5,000 years ago, and in one of its lower chambers a man's voice at one particular low pitch sets the entire room ringing, a resonance you feel in your chest and your skull long before your mind works out where it comes from. Researchers have gone in and measured it. The chamber appears to have been deliberately shaped to resonate near a specific frequency of the human voice, and nobody can tell you for certain why. At Newgrange in Ireland, and in the chambered mounds scattered all along the Atlantic coast, the same peculiar fact keeps rising to the surface. These are among the very oldest built spaces on the whole earth, and a surprising number of them behave like instruments, tuned neatly to the range of a single person standing inside and singing. We are asked to believe this is coincidence, over and over, in culture after culture, on continent after continent, across thousands of years. Perhaps it truly is. Or perhaps the shaping of stone to answer the human voice was never a decoration we cleverly invented, but a knowledge we inherited and did not value and mostly threw away. We call that acoustics, and we move on, and we are proud of ourselves for having a word for it. But what if the ornament was not decoration at all? What if the sixfold stars and the branching stone and the endless woven interlace that Adelaide suddenly recognized from her own voice figures were never merely art but instructions, a record, cut permanently into stone, of the shapes that sound is capable of making, a memory left by a time when people understood that the right note struck in the right room did something real, and who therefore built their most important rooms very deliberately to do it, and carved the proof of it into the ceiling in a language of pure geometry, so that it could never be entirely lost. And then it was lost anyway. Almost. Because look honestly at what happened to sound itself in the century after 1885. The pitch was standardized, and then pushed higher again, and eventually fixed for good at a value chosen for the convenience of orchestras and instrument factories, and for nothing to do with the human body and nothing to do with any older reason. There was a movement, quiet but real, of musicians who argued the standard should sit lower, who pointed back to the tunings Verdi had preferred, who insisted the higher number strained voices and dulled, something they could feel but could not measure. They lost. The old tunings, the ones Signor V mourned, the ones that had varied from one river valley to the next, were flattened into a single number handed to everyone, and live singing inside great resonant stone rooms. The one thing nearly every community on earth once did together every single week was slowly replaced. First by recorded sound played through a horn, then a speaker in the corner, then a small bud pressed into your own ear, private and sealed, resonating with nothing but the inside of your own skull. We took a species that had spent tens of thousands of years standing inside singing stone, and we sat it down, alone, facing a screen. Whatever the old rooms were truly for, we had arranged things so that we would never again stumble onto the answer by accident. That is the economic history hiding underneath the ghost story. Not a war, not an empire wiped off the map in a single night of fire. A slower thing, and a far more familiar one. The same thing that happens to almost everything eventually. The quiet conversion of something that had been free and shared and woven into the ordinary fabric of a town, the resonance of a stone room packed with human voices, into something you now have to buy. A ticket, a subscription, a device you replace every 2 years. Control the pitch, and you control what the instruments can play. Control the instruments, and you decide which rooms are even worth building anymore. Declare firmly that vibration can never be a source of power, and you protect the balance sheet of everyone who sells power by the unit. None of it requires a villain twirling a moustache in a locked room. It only requires that wherever the profitable answer and the true answer parted company, the parting was quietly allowed to stand, and that the people who noticed out loud, the Keeleys and the Watts Hugheses and the Adelaides, were admired for an afternoon, and gently set aside, and finally forgotten inside a box in a plastic sleeve at a country auction. I keep coming back to one line near the end of the notebook, after the torn-out pages, where she has clearly already decided to stop. She writes that she went back to that chapel a second time, in broad daylight, rested and sober and calm, and stood before the east window with the full sun pouring in behind it, and saw only glass. Old, rippled, entirely ordinary glass, with the yew trees and the leaning headstones plainly visible through it exactly where they should be. She writes that she was relieved, truly relieved, and that she meant to put the whole thing out of her mind. And then she writes one more sentence, and it is the sentence I have not been able to put down since I first read it. She writes that as she was leaving, the old verger who kept the chapel told her, without her ever asking, that the east window was not original to the building, that the true medieval glass had been pulled out and sold off generations earlier, and that what she had sung to that night was a plain and cheap replacement, younger than she was herself. She had seen a city through a pane of glass that could not possibly have remembered anything at all, which means, if she saw it, then it was never the glass that was doing the remembering. I do not know what Adelaide Merrow saw in the spring of 1885. I am not going to sit here and swear to you that it was a drowned civilization shining up through a window, because I owe you a great deal more honesty than that would be. The exhausted singer and the bad glass and the starved lungs explain the entire episode neatly, and on most days that is exactly where I come to rest. But then I remember that the shapes were real, that the voice figures are sitting right now in a published book that you yourself can go and find, that Chladni's patterns are true, and Faraday's are true, and cymatics is a real field, that the pitch genuinely was standardized in that precise year across the whole of the Western world, that a man really did convince a nation of hard businessmen that he could pull limitless power out of pure vibration, and really was buried as a liar at the exact moment it would have mattered most for him to be right. Every single anchor surrounding the vision is solid stone. Only the vision itself is soft. And maybe, in the end, that is the entire design of the thing. Maybe the way you erase a whole kind of knowledge is not to burn the books, which only makes people hunt for them. Maybe you simply arrange for the true part to sound every bit as ridiculous as the false part. You mix the ferns grown out of a living human voice in with the ghost city in the window, invite everyone to laugh at all of it at once as a single silly bundle, and then quietly standardize the note so no one will ever again go looking, by accident, in the dark, for the old one. The stones still ring if you stand in the right room and sing. The old glass has been replaced nearly everywhere, over and over across the centuries, until almost none of the first glass survives to be sung to. And the note we all tune to now is not the note she was told to go and look for. Make of that what you will. The archives do not forget. They only wait, patiently, in their boxes and their plastic sleeves, for someone to come and sing to them the way she once did, in the old pitch, alone, holding it steady until the very last of the breath runs out, and the shape at last comes clear.